I think we'll just get started, right? All right. Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome to my workshop. Guess what it's about? It's about narratives. Okay, sweet. Next. Why are we doing this? Like, actually, what is the purpose of this workshop? I think it's actually, like, for pretty simple, like, analytical reasons. I think generally what happens is that the way we structure arguments is built on narratives. I think the reason this is the case is just that often in debate, you just have to disseminate a lot of information in a very short period of time. And narratives are kind of like shorthand that we're all familiar with. So we often do just derive our arguments from like prominent narratives. We often cross-apply things that appear in narratives we're familiar with to try and understand topics that we aren't familiar with. I also think this just is a way you can unlock certain strains of argumentation. If you understand certain narratives and think them to be true or valuable, this can just be a way you can access certain arguments that you wouldn't think of under normal circumstances. I also just think that because, again, you have to disperse a lot of information in a short amount of time, I think sometimes people build their analysis on these narratives in ways that can create certain issues, and when you're looking for it, you will just find it more often. And I think this does just allow you to flag when people do this. It's like, okay, you've done this badly because it's built on this narrative, which doesn't work in X scenario. We'll have a whole thing on how people apply narratives badly. Okay. Oh yeah, some bullshit, some nerd shit. This is the other reason I did this. So, if you go on debate data, you can just take all the motions and put them in a spreadsheet, which is what I did. And if you look, there are give or take about 900 to 1,000 motions that go between Glasgow Euros and Panama Worlds. I saw 43 which explicitly used the word narrative in them. I'd like to point out that this also doesn't include opposes the glorification, opposes the rise of, which are also usually narrative debates as well. Another thing which is helpful to note in this analysis is just that often these have been used for like novice out-rounds. That's quite a popular use of the regrets the narrative that X, but they also are just used in open rounds and out-rounds in general. I think the reason they're used for like novice debates though is that learning to debate narratives effectively does kind of give you the bedrock to do more complicated and nuanced argumentation. So if you weren't convinced by my other analytical shit, here's some nerd shit which will hopefully bring you on my side so you all know why we are here. Okay, so we're going to do a bunch of, there's this type of narrative and this type of narrative for a while, and I'm just going to be explaining what they are and why it's helpful to like be aware of the distinction, all right? Fire. Okay, so these are like actual narratives, explicit narratives. This is probably the type of thing you're thinking about when you're thinking about narratives, so you know, like music or books or movies and shit. Like, these are the kind of things that people are like familiar with. These are the ones that we tend to have the greatest degree of familiarity with. These are ones that are very accessible. I think the big thing I'd like to point out about this type of narrative explicitly in a Western context is just that, like, a narrative is a narrative generally regardless of the medium by which the artist chooses to express their message. But I think particularly, it is just the case that you don't have to, like, transcribe your narrative onto something for it to be a legitimate narrative. Like, you don't have to write it down into a book or like record it onto wax for it to be considered a legitimate narrative. I think that word of mouth and oral tradition are also equally valid ways that narratives spread, and I think you should be cautious of assuming that narratives are only like spread through this more direct way. I think the other thing that can happen is that these types of narratives, like these types of stories that can get passed down, do tend to bleed into myth or folklore, either like explicitly if you're talking about like older, more traditional cultures, but I also think that it's the case that like over time, you do just kind of have a broader, like, Western or, like, societal mythos that emerges, and it is actually that these explicit works that tend to be the way this happens. So if you want, like, explicit debating reasons why these are relevant, I also think that these, like, can be seen as works that codify cultural attitudes that represent how people feel about something at a particular point in time. I think this is just a thing that happens a lot. I think it's also true that narratives kind of like tell you what cultural ideas are relevant at a particular time, because you can't create your narratives in a vacuum. So like the artists who create them are just going to be living in a time where they are also like in the presence of certain ideas, and the ones that they choose to actually make stories about tend to be the ones that are the culturally dominant in time. Think Great Gatsby, think Butterfly. There we go. That's relevant now. Next. These are the big ones. We love these in debate. These are like implicit narratives or like cultural narratives. These tend to be the ones that, like, if you see a motion that says the narrative that X, this is what we're talking about like a lot of the time, right? These are the kind of things where it's like, even if someone doesn't explicitly write it down, I mean, yeah, Invisible Hand is just in a book, but that's not the point. I think like these are just ideas that people tend to like become familiar with, even divorced from the actual narrative that helped spread them, if such a thing exists. And so I think that like the reason, like things that might make this easier to understand is like, if you think about the US, you have things like Manifest Destiny. This is a social narrative that spreads. If you have like, in economics, you have things like the invisible hand, the nature of markets, and things like this that tend to become cultural narratives that people believe. You know, certain stereotypes about how X group is supposed to behave or how X group acts are examples of cultural narratives that tend to become particularly prevalent. I also think that in the debate context, these are the ones that you can like very explicitly tie to having very like pernicious harms when they are spread without people thinking very consciously about them, right? So I think when these narratives are present, these are the ones that you can most credibly claim impact the way people see each other, the way people talk about each other, and often this is just happening without people like doing this consciously. So, I don't know, little exercise. Think of an example of something like this that will go, fuck it, economic, political, social. Economic or like, yeah, economic example of a narrative that tends to spread.
The market solves for everything.
Yeah, like pretty much.
Yeah, the free market just exists and it's great and will solve whatever.
Yeah, I think also, like, basically every economic school of thought kind of has one of these really big ideas, you know, the monetarists are like, oh, just take money in and out of the money supply and that's how you grow or decrease wealth, that kind of thing. Okay, anyone got a political example?
I think an interesting example of an implicit political example is different political spheres have different implicit ideas as to what human nature is and what people are likely to be ascribed to. So when you're often defending specific ideas of like, even comparing socialism versus capitalism, you're actually defending ideas that relate to what humans are and how they're likely to act. But when people are engaging within those debates, they are not often even aware that those are the arguments in which they are supporting. So oftentimes implicit narratives can like be almost Trojan horsey in a way, where like the undercutting premise of an idea is something where people are not aware of because the way in which they've engaged with the initial idea is so like taught down to them via like the community they're in or books they've read, etc.
Okay, this one should be the easiest. Just like something that happens socially about people, who they are, how they act, what they think, that is like broadly applicable. I don't know. Anyone have something specific that comes to mind?
People who are met with lenience will take advantage of the system.
Yeah, this is fair. I think that this is true. This has been used, like, typically when people want to, for example, like restrict the rights of certain people, restrict their access to certain social benefits, they tend to take advantage of these kind of narratives. Okay, but I have a thing on how like these narratives tend to form, which I think is just that people tend to have cultural experiences that they commonly understand, and they also tend to have feelings about those like experiences directly, and I think those tend to coalesce to form narratives that are particularly able to spread and that people tend to be able to buy into. I think often people will have those experiences and have the emotions about those experiences and won't actually give a lot of thought into how their emotions connect to these experiences. And I think the person who creates the narrative is uniquely able to access the lack of introspection that people have or do, where it's just like, oh, why do I feel this way? They're like, oh, this thing happened to you, and you feel this way. It's because X narrative is true. This is just an example of how people tend to be able to like actually use these to do things. So I think, yeah, so it's like cultural cultural symbols and ideas are communicated via stories, they can also just be directly created. So yeah, I think this is broadly the explicit, implicit dichotomy and why it's important how they manifest and all that jazz. Okay, thanks. Sweet. Okay, so I think this is more specific to debate, and I think this is just how different types of narratives actually, how different narratives are fundamentally structured. So some narratives, by their very nature, are very context dependent. In order for the narrative to meaningfully form, there is a lot of specificity that the narrative encodes within what it's telling the story about. This looks like, in a debate context, just the narrative we're talking about immediately does the place setting and the time setting of the debate. So this looks like the trauma plot in media and art. For that to happen, you have to understand a specific time, a specific trend in media, and so then it kind of fixes you in time. And similarly, that all failed relationships are learning experiences. That's a very new narrative that is emerging, and so therefore the context of the debate and the context of the narrative is quite fixed and is not necessarily cross-applicable, because there are a lot of things that have to be true for that narrative to exist. I think there are broader narratives that just aren't restricted in the same way, and so the big ones about political economy and how we organize ourselves are also examples of this. But this can also just be things when it's a one-liner that's just kind of this is a thing about life. Those also tend to be quite broad or vague and tend to be cross-applicable across societies. So I think, yeah, this is a helpful, another dialectic dichotomy to understand. I think, I don't have it on a slide, but I think there is also just, and I think this happens more with vague narratives, in one sense, and then the other version of this happens more with context-given narratives. So I think vague narratives tend to be a little bit more normative. And so normative narratives are just narratives that are about what is good and what is true. And they tend to be divorced from actual action. It's you always believe that we should treat people as equal. You always believe that we should treat people as redeemable, right? Things that you think are good and true in all cases. And then there are prescriptive narratives which talk about what you should do. And these tend to be a little bit more normatively flexible. They don't have to argue that the thing they're saying is good in all cases, but they do argue that it is the best possible action in the cases that the narrative concerns. Okay, I think that's...
One specific thing to add on to vague narratives, it can often be difficult to know how to debate those because of the fact that the context themselves are different. So oftentimes teams approach it in two ways. The first one is that you place set it yourself. So for example, this house opposes the glorification of intelligence. You define the place in which it is most important, for example, education and universities, and then explain why that's the biggest impact and I think that's most important, and you can define the behaviors of how people interact with that and just general debating. The other way of debating these narratives is do it people first and then spaces afterwards. That is to say, what sorts of people influence with this narrative, where do they hear it in the spaces, and how do they internalize it, and then in which spaces does this end up having impacts. Both have positives and negatives and often depend on the narrative which you're approaching, but just being aware of what angle teams are taking and what angle you want to take when approaching these vague narratives makes it far easier in prep time to come up with arguments, because oftentimes you have a big idea and you know this big idea is relevant, but then thinking about impacts can often be very hard to get to. Next time.
Okay, so this is just more stuff on how narratives spread, on who gets to control how narratives spread. And so I think the way I'm going to talk about this is kind of twofold, because I think there are in terms of what actually allows a narrative to spread, I think there are two broad things that you have to think about. And the first is what about the narrative itself lends itself to being spread. So that is just universality, flexibility, empirical truth. If you can stress test the truth of a narrative, it tends to be quite easy to buy into. If a narrative can be if people can take different things out of a narrative, this is also quite helpful, because then it means that they can find a way to make that narrative consistent or congruous with prior beliefs. And then yeah, universality, if it applies to everyone, then it's a bit easier for the ideas to spread. I think if you look at big political shifts that happen in society, they tend to talk about things that people find very easy to broadly connect to. I don't know, when someone says that, when the Constitution's all men are free and equal, I think that's pretty easy to connect to on a fundamental level, whereas when narratives are hyper-specific, then I think people do tend to feel like they don't have as much to connect to. But again, it's not a meritocracy. Not all narratives do actually compete in this free marketplace of ideas. I think it's kind of like a bullshit concept. But I think like the actual thing that's worth talking about here is if that's not the case, then what is happening? I think when we're talking about like explicit narratives, I think this happens in two ways. I think that the important thing to note here is that often the people who have control over the distribution of art and the people who just are the ones who allow or disallow people to actually propagate art to a meaningful extent often have their own agendas. And so insofar as this is true, often they want to like justify or reinstate their hierarchy. So they tend to push out narratives that support this idea. And I think like this just means that where you want to, if you want to understand the hierarchy of a society, you should look empirically at the kind of narratives that are popular or the kind of narratives that get broad like support by those in power in that society. I actually think this is a very helpful way of trying to understand this. So yeah, this is like those at the top seek to legitimize their rule and tend to support narratives which affirm their position. They also tend to suppress narratives that challenge it. So like if a narrative is particularly radical, then it can just look like not getting like a large degree of support. I mean, we'll talk about narratives that tend to concern like Africans very specifically, and in those cases, suppressed narratives often just means that you're going to get assassinated. This is like another example of the ways that those in power seek to control which narratives actually spread and which ones become popular through control of the media and things like this. I also think the other thing they can do is they can bake in the implicit narratives they want to spread into these explicit media, and so that looks like things that have like large-scale funding, tending to need to have, for example, positive portrayals of the police or the military in the 80s that looks like very like violent, jingoistic media being produced pretty uncritically and people consuming it without thinking deeply about what it actually says, that, you know, these people who are saving the day are like gunning down these brown people, and like these are just things that people do in like within popular media that is often not thought about to a great degree. And I think once again this does just support narratives that affirm the positions of those on top and like can be used to legitimize like pushing out people who you consider against you, I think is kind of what I'd say. So this is like competition of cultural narratives. Okay. Fun, okay, I have a metaphor here. So this says narratives is like Lego, or Life is Strange. What I mean by this is actually, I don't know if you've played Life is Strange, it's like a choice game. You go through the story and then you make meaningful choices that affect the story. I think the main thing I'm trying to get across with this simile is just that basically certain narratives have certain pieces within them, but then what you actually decide ought to be done with that narrative is often within the control of the people who have the most power. And so when you have different people who are in power with different interests in different parts of the world, then they can just control these narratives to push certain agendas that like align with them. I think Joan actually gave me this specific example, but it's like in specific places, you'll have things like falling birth rates be considered not that big of a deal, and then in other places, the idea of falling birth rates constitutes like a national health crisis or whatever. And often there are implicit narrative ideas that are like underpinning these different treatments of what is essentially the same thing. I think another example is just, if you hear the narrative, the West has fallen, depending on who you are, this will mean, like this will be a good thing. It means that you have to move past the West and evolve past Western ideals. But if you are a different person, this is a call to like revive the West. That the fact that the West has fallen is bad, and it's because X, Y, Z people have done this to the West, and so you have to bring it back. And so I think, again, if we're talking about things like this, actor analysis is actually really important. Who will have power over these narratives? What are their aims? How will they seek to use these narratives to spread it? I think this becomes important if you find yourself debating a narrative that you just think is generally good. I think when you want to connect it to certain harms, you have to think about who, when given the power of having this narrative be culturally dominant, might seek to use it to like control people in meaningfully harmful ways. So I think the other thing about like a lot of this sort of materialist ideas of, you know, narratives only spread because those who are in power give people the means to do so, and so they tend to only support their interests. Like this is just not this is not entirely true all the time, and I think it is worth recognizing that. Like, the extent to which you can suppress the spread of narratives is sometimes limited, right? And I think this becomes important when I told you, like, earlier on, where I was like, you don't have to transcribe something for it to be a narrative that is valuable and that can spread. I think this is also true in those instances, because it is easy to limit people's control or access to things like overtly printed media. But if you organize a march ad hoc, if you organize a speech underground, then these are things that often the ruling class have limited capacity to protect. I also just think that there are times where people are willing to be convinced of certain things that run counter to the dominant cultural narrative. And so this is also just true some of the time. But I do think that it is valuable to understand the idea of how narratives are built, who gets to control them, and how they spread.
Okay, next. Oh, this is my part.
Yeah,
So this is kind of what Luyanda has saying for the past 2 slides, but giving it different words. These dominant, emerging, and residual cultures come out of Marxist analysis that tends to explain why is it that, how is it that capitalism evolved, and how do other systems of power evolve? But I think the analysis can generally be applied to narratives as a whole, because it's generally associated with culture. They identified 3 different types of culture. The first is dominant, and a dominant culture is something that aims to preserve itself or preserve the people that are within power. So these are the things which most of us kind of believe, and because we're kind of all living in a dominant culture, and most people reside in a dominant culture, it's made by the people who have the mechanisms of power to then try and spread it and conflict the ideology with it. So for example, the divine right of kings was an example of dominant culture at a time, where even if it didn't benefit everyone at the bottom, everyone believed in it because it was spread by those who maintain power. Dominant cultures can take the form of various things, such as democracies or whatever, but it's just generally those who hold levers of power are able to maintain themselves or keep themselves ongoing. Emerging cultures then are something that is new and arising that comes out of dominant cultures, and these can either be different or in many instances opposing what is within dominant cultures beforehand. Sometimes the emerging culture doesn't necessarily have to be opposing the dominant culture. It can just come out of an idea that already exists within the dominant culture, that the dominant culture then gobbles up, right? So for example, I think capitalism and the way in which we have regarded capitalism over a period of time, all of those ideas had to have been emerging, but because a lot of them were supportive of capitalism, such as so for example, democratic capitalism, where like you hold in power and you try and spread and you try and spread around the entrenching of free market ideals. That, for example, was an emerging culture that didn't exist when capitalism was first emerged, but because it worked together with the dominant culture, it was able to be gobbled up by it. Some emerging cultures can themselves be radically opposing towards dominant cultures, and then there's an interesting tension there of how do emerging cultures that seek to displace or disagree with dominant cultures interact, and sometimes it happens with what Luyanda says of you have an active suppression and those ideas don't develop further, but oftentimes in reality and in most situations, it kind of comes to a compromise in the middle, and something new gets formed, and that then becomes a new dominant culture. Residual is an idea that is, in the current dominant culture, there remain a current number of ideas and issues which weren't there before and may not necessarily by themselves be working together with the way in which the dominant culture is, but because of the way in which dominant and emerging cultures have had to work against one another, it is then something which had to have shifted its presence in the dominant culture because otherwise people wouldn't have accepted it. So the intuition for this is just thinking about how different cultures are different, because in order for a culture to spread, it has to be developed on the bed of the previous culture, and so it means that certain ideas and themes are able to be continued over a period of time. So emotion, which explicitly talks about this, is this how supports the narrative that all people are redeemable. That narrative, that all people are redeemable, can sometimes be incongruous with the narrative that we currently live in of like capitalistic, everyone has their own actions and therefore should be judged based on their own actions, and it sometimes can be contradictory towards it. However, it is a narrative that still survived based on people's turning from the church and the way in which they find their moral value out of the church towards secularism. And so some aspects of church morality were able to be carried over into current morality. When you get rid of this narrative, now you have the current dominant culture with its own specific interests and incentives be able to describe how people then become to be redeemable, and that's when Luyanda's analysis kicks in of like the power structures want to make themselves beneficial and want to highlight other negatives. The end impact of what I'm trying to say and all the words that I'm using is that the way all narratives kind of exist within either of these three spaces. The question when you enter a debate is this a narrative that exists predominantly dominantly by itself? Is this a narrative that is new, that we haven't seen before? Or is this a narrative that is neither something that is new, nor is it something that is large, but is still something that is a core premise of how we interact with the world, in which case it is more likely to be residual or coming back from previous times before. Another interesting thing regarding this is that the question then becomes, okay, well, if dominant cultures get to influence people, how do emerging cultures ever arise in the first place? And I think the idea that you can bring about here, and a theory that people use, is that once you are able to name a narrative, once you're able to name a time in history, once you're able to name a culture, you are only able to do that retrospectively, and hence you are never able to name what is happening currently within society. So an example that we could use in like the field of media is the idea of genres, for example. In the moment where genres are happening, no one like Shelley did not sit down being like, I'm going to write a gothic genre piece of book, right? She wrote the book because that's what she was thinking of that time, and people looked back and called it the Gothic genre. Hence, it means that once you're able to name that narrative, the current way that people are interacting with that narrative necessarily has to be different with how they are interacting with the narrative before, because the space at which you're interacting with it has changed, because now you're able to label it, you're able to give it names, you're able to describe it patterns. But once you're able to describe it patterns and names, then people interact with the idea in a radically different way. So I think that's also another interesting tool to think about whether or not the narrative you're thinking about is actually manifesting in the way in which the narrative says for it to be manifesting. Because for that to be true, then it means that the narrative itself kind of isn't. Because if you're able to label it, then there's patterns you can join back to. So the way people are currently talking about it has to be different than what it's previously done before. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions with anything I've just said? All right, cool. It's just something that I think works, that attaches quite nicely onto Luyanda's analysis, and is an interesting way of thinking about how people can spread narratives and how people can form the current narratives they want to spread, but their limitations in actually allowing people to believe in them, and what it takes in order for new ideas to be able to emerge, and how those ideas are then incorporated within culture. Another example of this could just be eco-terrorism, right? For a period of time, environmentalism and eco-terrorism was considered something that was anti and trying to push against the norm, and then capitalism was able to just absolve it, and now it's able to become commercialized by itself, or something that is able to be accepted. What is radical is only radical for such a period of time, and the way in which you regard it has to necessarily change entirely once you're able to call it radical. Cool.
Wait, before you move from the slide, I think another thing that's worth noting in terms of like this dominant, emerging, residual kind of idea, I think is particularly how very strong dominant narratives can like work to fold in emerging ideas that seek to challenge their power structures into themselves. I think capitalism is probably the best example of a narrative, or like a narrative idea that does this well. I think critiques of capitalism tend to get a lot of funding, and then the people who make those critiques of capitalism get very rich and lose their ability to effectively critique capitalism. I think this happens in music, particularly new or interesting musical ideas tend to just get aped by those who are popular and then tend to lose some of their bite. I think where this becomes particularly interesting is where the emerging ideas tend to be like social or political in nature. I think an example of like this way up and why it's like, important is if you've ever seen the 2014 HWS round robin final, it was literally about whether leaders of social movements should gain political power. And it's for this exact reason. It's this idea that once what is emerging becomes part of the dominant, do you still have as much control over how you get to spread that narrative, or how people interact with that narrative? Because when it's smaller, obviously fewer people are having a say in how that narrative is propagated, but you just lose that in the search of mass appeal, or like just as a result of gaining mass appeal. So
yeah, the best way to weaponize this is when a narrative comes up, just think about where has that narrative resided from, which I guess is like the overall theme of how to do narrative workshops, is if you're able to identify where they come from, you can argue for them very, very concretely. But if you're able to identify what is the space in which, or what is the feeling that someone was feeling to make them act a specific way, and made multiple people act in specific ways, to then be able to label it a narrative or a trend or a pattern, then I think you're developing a far deeper understanding of that narrative itself, which then you're able to bring to the case.
Sweet. Okay, we have a checkpoint. This is a different color because these are like tangentially related to the broader thing about narratives. I think in particular, this is like a discussion of a very particular narrative and how it works to like oppress and harm certain individuals. I actually think this is just really useful analysis for a number of reasons. I might have a why does this matter on this, I'm not sure. Why does this matter? Brilliant. Okay, so just that, the delta, it can be hard to find in a lot of narrative debates. I think often people get very speculative. Often people say maybe this changes people, like maybe something happens. I do just think these can get wishy-washy if you don't like try very intentionally to carve out an impact. So I actually think this is just an example of things that can be done like in a way that you can actually claim is particularly useful. I think the other thing here is just that when you're talking about oppressed peoples and the way narratives affect them, I think it is actually just really easy to weigh that they are the most vulnerable actors, and so the harms that affect them can just be weighed as more intense than harms that happen to more people but maybe don't affect them to the same degree. So this is why I'm doing this. Sweet. Okay, so yeah, self-hate, racism's cousin. This is basically a discussion of a kind of scholarship that emerged within the 20th century. Within the African diaspora, there are like native African writers who talked about this. Frantz Fanon did this. There are Southern African writers who did this. Steve Biko did this. There are American writers who did this. W.E.B. Du Bois did this. But basically, the fundamental thing that they tried to do is like understand how oppression affects the psyche on a fundamental level, right? Because I think this becomes particularly relevant when discussions of freeing people from oppression only talk about the material manner in which they are oppressed and don't actually do any meaningful work to consider how you repair a psyche that has been damaged by oppression. And so I think what they actually just tried to do is like illustrate the claim. And I mean, it didn't just happen in academics works. This also happened in fiction. A lot of Toni Morrison's writing is also like this. Where like you just make the claim that black people across the world had broadly come to accept the narrative of their own inferiority, and this would become true separate of whether or not they were actually being actively oppressed in the same direct ways that they were prior. And there's a lot of ways that this narrative of their own inferiority was spread. So I think like a simple one is just the suppression of your native culture. When you don't have like the same things that you can take pride in as other people do, you do just often lose your sense of place, your place of pride, your place of dignity in the world. It was just very often a thing, particularly in colonial Africa, where people were separated from their families. This does just lead to a disconnect between different generations. I think this is particularly true insofar as there was a lot of spreading of oral tradition within African cultures, and I think this directly harms things like that directly. I think when you don't have a strong sense of self, then the narrative that, like, if you believe in your own worth, someone telling you that you aren't worth much often doesn't do much. But if you don't have that built in, then that can actually be quite meaningful. And then yeah, imposition of European language was also very important, because when you take people's language away from them, you take away a fundamental way in which they've learned to understand and interpret the world. And then when you impose your language from without, often at a later stage, often without full access to the learning materials that other people have, then what happens is not only do they lose connection with their own language, occasionally they just have certain limitations in the ways they can express themselves in the new language. And the new language comes to like represent a great deal of power. I think this is true in places that have like the residual effects of colonialism lasting very strongly. I think British African countries actually have this to a very strong degree, where like speaking proper English, quote unquote, is a sign of cultural, like it is a form of cultural cachet. And when certain people don't have the same access to mostly education, which gets people there, then they come to like internalize that they are, for example, less intelligent. So yeah, outcomes of this narrative are twofold. One is just you hate your own blackness, or you hate, so like this actually happens two ways as well. You come to hate yourself, and by virtue of your self-hatred, hate the color of your skin, or you come to sort of see the color of your skin as the root of all your problems, and so it's like, it's the thing that makes your life worse, and so you come to resent the fact that you are black. I think another way this happens is just a desire to resist this narrative in a meaningful way. And like, often this does just look like pushing for social progress, but often it just looks like fighting this narrative through like your own self as much as is possible. And so I think that just means that you want to be one of the good ones. You want to speak the good English. You want to prove a level of superiority over other people who share your culture or your skin color. And so yeah, I think that this does actually mean that even when you have systems of oppression that get taken away, even when these countries gain things like political independence and are no longer like colonies of another country, then I think the actual ability for people to self-actualize in that new country is just meaningfully limited despite the equality that exists on paper. Okay, that was a lot. Any questions?
I'd also like to add, sometimes a lot of this doesn't have to be carried out with malicious intent, or the actors that they influence with doesn't have to necessarily be done out of a space of harm. Like, it can be almost as simple as, what are the beauty standards of society, what cutlery do you use, what music do the people listen to, who are the role models you look up to when you're a child. These are things that still necessitate and carry on those things going forward, but it shows how cultures can regurgitate themselves, and kind of, even once they've lost the people carrying behind the evil stuff.
Sweet. I think with that, this is the motion prep.
Wonderful.
I don't know how you're gonna.
No, it's alright.
It's all yeah. Well, it's interesting because Adam's kind of right. You are kind of achieving for the same thing, and both class struggle and background rigidity have very strong crossover. It's just different points of the stream that you're pointing towards of how far back are you willing to say someone's oppression actually is. So I think focusing on how the individuals interacting with the social movements would feel are often the easiest ways of interacting with motions like these, especially when they're a little more vague or ideological. I don't think we have time to get the back and forth, so we'll just move on.
Sweet. Okay. Checkpoint 2. Dominant Western narratives. Okay, fine. So what we'll do here is just these. So the reason why I think this is actually important is just basically, I think I'm right. These are just the things that people tend to believe even without recognizing the extent to which they believe them to be true. And I think like the main thing here is just that like the premise of other claims that people make in debate can often be drawn back to some of these like broader dominant like Western narratives. I think like these are the kind of things that you probably hear referred to as like meta-narratives in postmodern philosophy, and I think it is just generally helpful to flag them, think about why they might or might not be like easy for people to buy into, what flaws might exist, how people might seek to undermine the premises that these narratives are built on. Okay, so I don't know, I did like pre-colonial, colonial, because these were like the big two I thought of, and the ones I thought were particularly important, and then I did 3 and 4 because I think they are the ones that tend to like dominate discussion as it exists in the modern day to a pretty meaningful degree. I also think they're the ones that again premise fairly big significant arguments that you will see run in terms of being good or bad or all that. Okay, so this is the West as paragons of rational thought. You guys go to a university. Like, it's so insane the extent to which you see Western society like suck off Greek and Roman philosophy. It's actually absurd. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, this idea seems to be that like Rome and the ancient Greeks kind of exist as epicenters of rational thought, as like beacons in the darkness of like pre-civilization or whatever the hell, and that like they were the first people to start thinking about like maths and morality and all these big important things that we love so much. So I think this is one of the more prevalent things. I think it becomes important when they like cross-compare to other societies of the time. I think when you look at some of the words we use to prejudice against people, things like barbaric or brutish tend to have origins in describing people who are not Roman or Greek people. I think if you go further in time, this looks like people who are not like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, this kind of thing. So it's just the idea of like Western society as being like some hyper-rational or like at least some sort of front-runner historically in the progress of rational thought. I think the other one is like the validity of Christian morality and the extent to which Christian morality is implicitly understood to be like the basis for broader like moral frameworks. I think this could have just been like the morality that exists within Abrahamic religion, but I think it is just true to some meaningful degree that because of things like expansionism and colonialism, I think Christian morality very specifically does tend to have a uniquely large impact in certain parts of the world. I think this is true in parts of Africa, and this is true in parts of South America. I think this is true in parts of Europe even. I think there is just an extent to which a lot of the ideas of what is good and what is right stem very directly from Christianity. And so this also justifies colonial actions like the Christianizing mission and like mission trips to Christianize people even to this day. Things like the Crusades are fought on the basis of like regaining what is like rightfully the domain of the Christian people, things like this. I think like Christian morality and things that are presumed to be virtuous on the grounds of like their prevalence in Christian thought are just particularly prevalent in the West. And so yeah, broad effects, they can justify imperial expansion. They tend to subjugate non-Western religions and religious ideas. I think this looks like the idea of like a monotheistic religion has just become the culturally dominant way we talk about religious belief. Things like that also leads to religious warfare and things like that. So I think these are like the two big ones that are worth flagging as existing in the pre-colonial and colonial times, the ones that were like instruments of power for those who sought to oppress and undermine at those times. Okay, so number 3, American Dream. I think we've talked about this in Nora's world building like CT, but yeah, I think the American dream has been particularly prevalent post-colonially, because I think what it does to some degree is it encodes the value of the idea that one can like rise from the lowest dregs of society and attain the utmost like wealth. I think as well this is born out of like a pushback against things like feudalism, against things like being taxed without representation. I think this is part of the reason it catches on.
To what extent do these ideas have cross-contamination? Because say, for example, one could argue that the American dream is a reflection of the certain Christian ideas, that people who are really good will have that, like in the eyes of God, will have that reflected in their material circumstances.
I think all of them do kind of bleed into each other a lot. I think sometimes you do try to block things off, and I think sometimes that's only useful insofar as you can flag things, but I think it's not like, you know, in one box is like the West is paradigms of rational thought, and in one box is like Christian morality. I think there is a degree of cross-contamination. I think this is more just a like categorically useful thing more than anything. Yeah, and then the 4th one, this happened a lot post-Cold War especially. I think it happened during Cold War, but I think it's become very dominant after its end. This is like the Fukuyama end of history thing, where it's just like, oh yeah, this is all we have left. Like capitalism is what will exist and what should exist. I think also, I think Wurdaan talked about this earlier, just the idea that capitalism appeals to some idea of like broad human nature to justify its correctness. This appeal to like the fact that we are like inherently greedy, or that more egalitarian systems will just lead to people abusing them and stuff like that. And so yeah, broad effects of these do just look like more globalization, neocolonialism, freedom fighting of the CIA.
In a debate, how do you think is the best way to go about defending something like the narrative of the American dream, like the narrative that you put up here, in a situation in which a motion puts you in a position to have to defend these sorts of things?
Oh, okay. I think with the American dream specifically, you can just kind of like weaponize the unique degree to which it does allow for social mobility. I think you can just claim to a meaningful extent that when you cross-compare to movements that existed prior to it, so that does look like feudalism, that does look like a sort of master state, colony state, that it is the American dream that was most able to actualize people's ability to actually get out of the most dire situations. And I think there can be questions about whether like things like leading to more egalitarianism are even inconsistent with that. You can even run the argument that this is actually like maximizing the extent to which that is true. But I think you can just say at the simplest level that this is like, for example, the way in which a lot of people were able to access social mobility that has just very meaningfully made their lives better.
Yeah, just to like add on to that. I think like with narratives that are harder to defend, there's a cringe way and a like in the debate more cringe, but like I think like in the spirit of debate less cringe way of defending them. So the cringe way is saying that people came up with a narrative, therefore they prefer the narrative, therefore the narrative is fine. That's really cringe, right? But like, you know, you can do that, be like, you know, it's popular, it's probably popular for good reason. And then I think the second one, and which what you did here, is just like say that the narrative is right. And I think you can just do that by cherry picking the best parts and saying that they're good. Like, you know, for example, with the West as paragons of rational thought, like you should be like, these philosophers are like pretty good, came up with like good things, like, you know, and rational thought is good for X, Y, Z reasons, and you know, the Western canon is like good for you know reasons that they provide us with X, Y, Z. I struggle to defend it, but yeah.
The third way I think I would do you can speak.
I was just gonna add on, in like cherry picking, I find what often helps me, at least when I'm thinking about things, is things I can sort of marginalize or at least mitigate and do that preemptively. So for example, if I was debating the American dream, I'd be like, this is distinct from American exceptionalism in XYZ ways, and this is why it doesn't fall under the debate. And then that way you can have the good stuff and try and at least say that some of the bad stuff is not in the realm of the debate.
Yeah, I think the third way of doing it is just saying that we all live under certain ideologies and perspectives that make us think in certain ways and get value out of different things. Just because you may not disagree with the narrative, you can just question the actual fulfillment that that narrative itself brings about. So a common way that, so it's kind of like the atheistic argument for why religion is good. Even if you think that religion is exploitative in a number of ways, the feeling that it gives to people and the meaning of fulfillment that it prescribes to people is itself something that we can argue to be a good, and hence if all preferences are subjective, to just, you aren't able to objectively say that a narrative is bad. You should just look at how people themselves feel within that narrative. Go.
If it's retrospective, I was pretty sure I judged this 2 weeks ago. I did judge this 2 weeks ago. I said at UCL Pro-Am, closing opposition 1. And their case was, so it was like this says the American dream has done more harm than good. So opposition says American dream good. And their case was like you can just do the really high burden, hard line. What the American dream does is it draws immigrants towards America, and like maybe sometimes this is a good thing because you get concentration of intellect. Like this is actually just like a brain drain, maybe bad for those other countries, but good for everybody else, because whenever you have all the smart people working together and bouncing ideas off of each other, like this is good, and we like it when that happens.
That one.
Yeah. It was really well proven, guys.
Me and Adam in that same debate had the American dream makes marginalized people fight for their rights.
That was not the same debate.
Basically, it was disaster against the American dream. So.
Okay. Hold on. Oh. Wait, go back. Yeah. Okay. Sweet. Then I have some like broader, more structural things you can say against these things. But before that, you give me things against these things. You're probably all familiar with these like narratives to some meaningful extent. So, I don't know. I should have had the ball so I could throw it at people. But it's fine. I don't know. Narratives.
Sorry, we're opposing that these things are good.
Or you're just giving me reasons to doubt that they are true.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I don't know. Why is it perhaps not true that the West are paragons of rational thought? Okay.
Well, number one, all of the shit that the Western empires did is clearly them just perpetuating the cycle of trauma that was inflicted on them during the Roman Empire. Like the British Empire trying to, be Rome, even though they were previously like slightly genocided by Rome. I mean, maybe that's not directly relevant to what you're saying, but I think also there's something that appears in narratives from people from specifically the British colonies coming to the UK during the 19th and early 20th century, where they have this idea that like, I'm going to go to Britain, it's going to be so incredible, because they've had this idea put in their head that Britain is great, and then they arrive in like Victorian era Britain, where there is industrialization that's keeping people in horrific poverty, and they lose this belief in empire because they see that the damage that is done abroad in, say, India during the Raj is also being done at home. Hypocrisy, basically.
Alex?
I mean, I was just gonna argue that I guess like ancient Greece and Rome can't be like the total paragon of rational thought. You can't just specifically look at that, especially when you have like, you know, the various like, I guess, like Muslim empires preserving all of that thought, and that's the only reason that it still exists, because during the Middle Ages, everyone just forgot about it. So like, we can't argue that, oh, Rome is the end-all be-all of like history or whatever, like they created so much stuff when like it didn't exist in the West for, you know, centuries, pretty much.
I buy this. Nora.
Yeah, I think you can expand on that also by talking about the idea that the West, with the amount of power, the amount of resources that it had the capacity to spread thought to a larger degree. Meaning that maybe a lot of people have these thoughts that we don't know, because these people just didn't have the access to tell people that these thoughts have been had outside of their local community. Additionally to that, the British Empire, the West, etc., had a lot of power over what thoughts were spread from places that they colonized, for example. People like Afro Ben were in lots of places were very pro-monarchy, like all that stuff, which meant that was heightened to a great extent. Those narratives were heightened, so they had power to control the narratives, but also power to just spread things to a greater extent.
About this, Freya, then Adam, then
For most of them, pretty sure, I would call like characterism as very obvious self-justifications for what you're doing. Like specifically, if you're going to take narrative 4, this is essentially just the capitalist, like scientific version of Divine Right of Kings. It's an appeal to like it's natural, it's scientific as a justification of capitalism rather than the appeal to religion for the justification of feudalism. So like characterizing that as a good like intuition way of being like they're saying this could be it.
Yeah, I think this cross applies to basically all of them. Okay.
Sorry to cut off Adam and I, but we have 10 minutes left, so we're just going to work through, because I think there's a lot of valuable stuff in the remaining part of the workshop.
Okay. Here are some counter narratives. This is just stuff I thought of about like why these can be argued to be false. The first one is kind of Alex's point, but just more, which is East-West divide, not a thing. Historically, it's just not a thing. It's made up. It's basically made up. I don't think it's real. I don't think it's an like accurate or valid way of looking at history. I don't think it's a valid way of understanding history at all. I think it just doesn't backwards apply to a lot of places within like North Africa, the Middle East, China. Like these are all just places that have made major leaps forward that are arguably more important, like or equally important at the very least, to the stuff that the Greeks and the Romans discovered. And actually, as Alex points out, like there was a lot of active work done by like Muslim scholars to actually preserve the works of the Greeks and the Romans. And insofar as this is true, I think this is just like something that is not historically accurate at all. Oh, also, human rationality, pretty limited most of the time. Like people just believe shit that isn't true. And so like this idea that the West are hyper-rational just does not hold up to even empirical scrutiny. So that's kind of my like broad thrust against the first narrative. And then so
Can you skip to your postmodernism stuff? Because
Yes.
that's probably the best.
okay, all of this you can read later. I'll put it up later. Yeah, postmodernism. So what is postmodernism? Broad skepticism, subjectivism or relativism, suspicion of reason, and sensitivity to the role of ideology. Why do I like this? Why do I think this is good? I think it's good at undermining the idea.
Just to clarify, the specific premise of postmodernism is that there is no objective truth, and all truths are subject in the context in which they're brought up in. So as postmodernist theories came about, they were undercutting a lot of these preordained narratives that Luyanda was talking about, and we're saying these are only true because specific powers wanted them to be true. There is no objective truth. We have to find our own truths. But sorry, continue.
But so I think it's helpful. It undermines the core idea of the narratives at all. People make arguments that are premised on previous narratives, and so understanding the issue with the idea of the premise of a grand narrative allows you to attack the argument at its base and not just like cut off trees instead of cutting off the root of the tree. So I think this is why postmodernism is pretty based, and then I think I have shit on like not always that based. I think it's just kind of for the reasons that I think sometimes what happens is because someone does it in a philosophy setting, and it's done by a Western scholar or whatever, then all of a sudden postmodernism is considered this groundbreaking, like new development in philosophy. But I do just think often things like relativism or pluralism are just things that when you are someone who lives under oppression by colonial powers. These are just things you kind of have to adapt to survive or to hold on to your beliefs to any meaningful degree. This just looks like things like holding on to your own indigenous like religious traditions while like coming to accept Christianity as like being true.
Do you want to explain what relativism and pluralism is?
Okay, sure. So I think relativism is just kind of the idea that there isn't an objective truth, that it's all context dependent. And so this applies to morals, to religion, and all of that. And then pluralism is just kind of that a multiplicity of different ideas can be true or can be valuable at the same time, and that this is how we ought to treat people's differing beliefs. I think that should be sufficient to explain those two concepts. And so yeah, I do just think that sometimes, like, postmodernism gives you a lot of helpful words and a lot of helpful frameworks, especially within debate, but I do just think it is helpful to recognize the extent to which postmodernism is just like a Western academic way of applying a lot of the sort of things that people had to do intuitively within their oppression by Western powers. I think that's me.
It's my rant section. Okay. One specific thing that I also realized in terms of Nora's question of how do you defend a narrative being good, I think the most powerful tool that hasn't been mentioned yet is just explain what the counter narrative looks like when that hasn't been brought up. All narratives exist on a spectrum of things being good or bad, but if you're arguing for the vacuum, the value of the narrative in the vacuum, sometimes that it's not really clear why that's good or bad. It has to have something to compare it against. So when you're arguing this, I think every team should think about what will be the likely narrative to espouse when that isn't the case. Oftentimes teams go for the a different narrative that we prefer and just kind of say something that obviously would have been far, far nicer to have espoused comes up, but that gets taken down by like actual analysis. So whenever you're arguing for counter narratives, give lots of explicit reasons to why that will be the narrative that's likely to come up. I think there are two sorts of counter narratives you can go for. The one is just the dominant culture counter narrative. That is to say, if this narrative were not there, the way in which we think about the world would have just stayed the same, and that is probably a good or bad thing for a number of reasons why. Don't feel afraid to just say, like, with the narratives in there, the current way we view the world would be fine, because a lot of narratives, especially narratives that are prescriptive, as in they say failed relationships are learning experiences, often confine meaning down into one specific way of looking at things, where if that narrative wasn't there, the pluralism that Luyanda says is so valuable would have been the thing that could have replicated it. The other thing is that I think it's very hard to explain what the emerging narrative would have been if that narrative doesn't come about. So anytime you're running the emerging narrative, and oftentimes when people run emerging narratives, they often say more information, that you see people as nicer, and it's generally your left liberal bullshit. I would be a lot more technical when you're running a counter narrative that isn't just the dominant narrative. In those instances, I'd point to like the historical knowledge you have, or historical trends or patterns that you've got to, which will then mean that you're able to place your counter narratives in genuine examples or intuitions that were around in a previous time but have recently died out. So that probably so like for example, the way in which people regard trade unions, for example, is something that has had a lot of change and ebb and flow throughout history, and if you're able to point to the point at which those narratives start to change, that is the point at which you're able to say your new narrative would have taken a hold. That's probably the most important thing I had to say, actually. Counter narratives can often win you debates entirely if you're able to explain what the counter narrative is very, very likely, because then it just means any other benefit or negative becomes incredibly clear. Does anyone have any like questions of narrative debates as a whole, or any like difficulties they have with them? All right.
Who should I send this role to? Who should I send this role to?
You can send it to me. I mean,